Welcome into another PFF NFL show. Max Chadwick alongside Dalton Wasserman here. And Dalton, we're going to break down all of the head coaching moves in the NFL and the brand new coordinators at all of those new stops as well in the NFL today. A lot of different coaching moves, and still one team, the New Orleans Saints, that has still not hired a head coach. We'll talk about them at the very end of the show and who they might be hiring. It feels like they're kind of zeroing in on one candidate, but I'm excited to break down all these coaching moves with you today.
Yeah, it's fun to figure out, especially through the offseason and the players that each team is going to acquire, how it all fits in with a new coach, with a new offensive system, with a new defensive system, and I'm kind of just glad we can get the speculation over with.
Yeah.
Right? Because eventually you just go, okay, hire somebody, let's get on with it so we can really quantify what we're trying to do here.
Absolutely. So we're going to break down a lot of PFF-specific stats today. I can't even talk today. Geez. About all these new coaches that we have in the NFL. And all those stats are available to you guys with a PFF Plus subscription. You can find it at subscribe.pff.com to get access to all those stats, to get access to our full 2025 NFL mock draft simulator. Our free agent rankings are available. The best betting tools on the planet are available as well. Of course, a lot of bets are going to be made for the Super Bowl 59 coming up very soon as well. So all of it available at subscribe.pff.com today. All right, first team we're talking about, Dalton, is the first team that filled their head coaching vacancy. That was the New England Patriots, hiring former Titans head coach Mike Vrabel after firing Gerard Mayo after 1 year and a 4-13 record with the Patriots. Obviously, Mike Vrabel, very successful in the NFL as a head coach before. He won Coach of the Year in 2021, 54-45 record with the Titans, 2 AFC South titles with the Titans, 3 playoff appearances, and he made the AFC title game back in 2019. And honestly, maybe a big reason why I got hired by the Patriots, he played 8 years for the Patriots as an edge defender. He won 3 Super Bowls with them and recently was inducted into the Patriots Hall of Fame. So what did you think of this hire of Mike Vrabel?
I think 3 of these 6 teams that we are going to talk about today wanted to hire a leader. And this is Mike Vrabel's right in that category, right? He's had success before. He's got ties to Robert Kraft in the Patriots. And I think they still seem to want someone at least familiar to the organization, right? They're not completely cutting off from, you know, the Patriot way and Bill Belichick and those connections and all that, right? And I think the underlying theme here is that they just need somebody who's an adult in the room and somebody who can develop a team around Drake May, right? It's obvious that they have their franchise quarterback. Last year, a lack of good offensive line play, a lack of receiving help. They just had a bare roster. We knew they were going to have the season that they had, right? They only won 4 games. They're picking 4th in the draft. It's just a struggle offensively, and really the same struggles offensively for the most part outside of Mac Jones' rookie year that they've had since Tom Brady left and went to Tampa. So I think it's really about just trying to stabilize the leadership. They tried it with a first-time head coach in Gerard Mayo. Didn't work. They wanted to get back to somebody that they were at least familiar with, and Vrabel is that guy.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned it before, the big reason for it, I think, with Robert Kraft hiring him is the Patriot way, right? The 2 coaches that succeeded Bill Belichick are now former defensive players of Bill Belichick. So they get it, right? They have the same kind of culture they're going to run in New England. And obviously, Vrabel as well, he's a coach with a proven track record. I mentioned all those stats before with him in Tennessee. He always seemed to overperform with Tennessee's roster as well. They always seem to go a little bit farther than you think they should have gone with a talent on that roster. And listen, it's going to be a rebuild in New England, but they have a lot of assets. They're actually first in offseason assets. We have a ranking out from Timo Riske at PFF.com, ranking every team in terms of offseason assets, in terms of their draft capital, in terms of their restructure potential, and in terms of their effective cap space. The Patriots are 4th in draft capital, and they have $113 million in effective cap space, the most in the NFL by $27 million. They're nearly $30 million more to play with than anyone else in the NFL. So yes, still a lot to get through here, but they have a lot of assets they could work with this offseason.
And that cap space is going to be a story really quick. We're going to hear them connected with T. Higgins. We're going to hear them connected with maybe Trey Smith, with Alaric Jackson from the Rams, maybe with Chris Godwin if he comes free from Tampa. You're going to hear at wide receiver and offensive line especially. Those are the 2 big areas that they need to improve. And it's going to be interesting to see how they build this with Josh McDaniels coming back for a 3rd stint as their offensive coordinator. And I think we have to remember, as a head coach, he might not have had any success elsewhere, but McDaniels has always had really good offenses. Obviously, he had Tom Brady for a while, but even as recently as 2021 with Mac Jones in his rookie year at quarterback, Patriots were second in the league in team offense grade. Their defense wasn't as great that year, and they ran into a buzzsaw in Buffalo in the playoffs, but it's clear that McDaniels is comfortable in New England. He's had success in New England, and he's just going to get Drake May to play more in rhythm, and obviously this year, couldn't do it as much without any pass protection, without anybody getting open, but that's going to be the idea. His offense is all about rhythm and timing, and getting Drake May to play with that, along with the creative skills that he has outside of the pocket, I think is going to be huge. So Josh McDaniels, look, this is the one spot he's always succeeded, right? And he's back at it for a third time, and we don't have too much of a reason to believe that he can't do it. I think when it came to Mac Jones, the team just continually eroded around him, and Jones didn't have anywhere near the arm talent that Drake May has.
Yeah, you mentioned Josh McDaniels. Speaking of the Patriot way, man, once again, like I said, the offensive coordinator for the Patriots. And then Terrell Williams is the new defensive coordinator. He was recently the defensive line coach and the run game coordinator for the Detroit Lions this past year. So that'll be an interesting one as well. I think the Lions did have a pretty good defensive line, all things considered, with all the injuries they had. So Terrell Williams, a deserved promotion for him in New England.
And someone who was Mike Vrabel's defensive line coach for just about his entire tenure in Tennessee also. So it's familiar. He's getting a shot at a promotion to run a whole defense. And you mentioned it, I think the run defense is going to be a big thing for him. You talk about those defensive line coaches. They really want to stop the run first and foremost. The Lions were 9th in run D grade this season. So I think, for as many struggles as they had as rushing the passer and in coverage, they could still stop the run. And that was a big emphasis for Detroit this year. And it was always an emphasis for Tennessee also.
And Williams has some exciting young players to build around on that defense. You got Christian Gonzalez, you got Christian Barmore, Keon White. Obviously, Josh McDaniels has a exciting young quarterback in Drake May that could be the franchise quarterback for them. In terms of what they got to do, you mentioned it. They got to build around Drake May, receiving core and offensive line-wise. They were the 3rd worst receiving grade this past year, 2nd worst pass blocking grade, and the worst run blocking grade in the NFL. So I think a lot of resources you mentioned before, with all the cap space they have, and maybe even with that number 4 overall pick, should be spent to just surround Drake May with as much offensive talent as possible.
That has to be the goal. That's it. It's Drake May. It's Drake May, and it's his world, and we're living in it.
Absolutely.
It's that simple. Build around your quarterback.
So New England hiring Mike Vrabel as their new head coach. The former Titans head coach and the former Patriots legend is now the head coach of the New England Patriots. Going to the next team, the Dallas Cowboys, hiring Brian Schottenheimer, who was the offensive coordinator for the Cowboys in the last 2 years. They fired Mike McCarthy, or actually not even fire him. They let his contract expire after 5 seasons and a 49-35 record with Dallas. Like I mentioned before, Schottenheimer was the Cowboys OC for the last 2 years. He was an OC for a long time before that as well. He was the offensive coordinator for the Seahawks from 2018 to 2020, the Rams OC from 2012 to 2014, and the Jets OC from 2006 to 2011. So Schottenheimer, very, very experienced as an offensive coordinator, finally now getting a shot as a head coach. The Cowboys, with him as the OC, were 13th in EPA per play. Rams, with Schottenheimer as the OC, 24th in EPA per play. And the Jets, with him as the offensive coordinator, were 20th in EPA per play. So not necessarily like one of the best offensive coordinators that we've had in the NFL, but I think Jerry Jones, I think what happened, Dalton, we got reports out saying, hey, Jerry Jones, Todd Archer from ESPN reported, Jerry Jones offered Mike McCarthy a 3-year contract. McCarthy wanted a 5-year deal. That obviously they wouldn't budge on that. So McCarthy ended up not going back to Dallas. And I think Jerry just wanted to keep it in-house with Brian Schottenheimer. And I hate to say it didn't really seem like it was Dallas's first choice either.
No, I think there was an element here where I get the feeling McCarthy didn't fully want to be back with kind of at times the circus that it can be in Dallas with the media and Jerry Jones and just the way everything is there. You're just constantly in the spotlight, and it seems like there's a lot of distractions. And I think there were other guys, especially coaches, that were making playoff runs that just turned it down because they didn't want to jump headfirst into all that. And it's not a roster and a front office that's in a great place right now. You look at all the injuries they dealt with this past year. It's a very top-heavy roster. They still have to figure out how they're going to pay Micah Parsons, because if they don't, then they have a whole different issue on defense, on a defense that already struggled a lot this year, especially when Parsons was off the field. This is an odd situation, because with Dak Prescott as your quarterback and the way the salary cap is and their top and the way that how top-heavy the roster is, it's kind of a win-now team. We saw that the 3 years prior when they won 12 games in each of the 3 years from 21 to 23. But I think Jerry's just trying to keep some sort of continuity. I think they believe internally that without the Prescott injury and several other injuries this season, that they would have been a contender for and even in the postseason. So they feel like they have a talented roster that can win a lot of ball games. I think they don't want to kind of rock the boat with Dak Prescott, especially now he's in his early 30s and he's making a boatload of money, and they have to build their offense around him. So, Schottenheimer didn't call the plays, but there's at least familiarity there, and that seemed to be the priority.
Yeah, and so his new coordinators in Dallas, Clayton Adams is the offensive coordinator. He was the Cardinals' offensive line coach most recently. And then Matt Eberflus. So maybe, Schottenheimer's not experienced as a head coach, but they do have an experienced head coach. The most recent Bears head coach is now the Cowboys defensive coordinator. How do you like those two moves right there?
So I think Adams, what it speaks to me, I don't know. I would assume Schottenheimer's going to call the plays, but I could be wrong on that. I think the theme for both of them is this team needs to run the football, right? The Cardinals did a great job running the ball. Their offensive line was 12th overall in the league this year in PFF grade. They really emphasized getting behind their offensive line, running the ball downhill with James Conner, throwing in some option concepts with Kyler Murray. You won't see that, but Brian Schottenheimer's always been a coach that wants to run the ball too. I can remember all the way back to his Jets days behind that great offensive line they had, and Thomas Jones and Leon Washington and Sean Green. That's just always been his identity. You go even to the Seattle days when he was there, and they wanted to have balance even though they had Russell Wilson in his prime, and I think that's really what's gotten away from Dallas. So when I look at the combination of Schottenheimer and Adams, they want balance in this offense. He's always wanted balance in this offense, and that brings up the question of whether are they going to draft a running back highly? Are they going to rebuild this offensive line, especially on the right side, at right tackle where Terrence Steele's getting older? Do they have a solution at left tackle because Tyler Guyton really struggled through his rookie year? These are all going to be questions, and Adams did a great job. I think about a guy like Paris Johnson with the Cardinals, did a great job developing him, and I think developing a Cardinals offensive line that maybe we didn't think in all 5 spots was that talented, but they had a really good year, and they were 4th in pass blocking grade too. So I think that's going to be the emphasis offensively is in the trenches. And then you look at Eberflus, and it's another familiarity thing. He was a Cowboys linebackers coach for 7 years, 2011 to 2017. Left for the Colts for a defensive coordinator job, did a good job there. I think it's different, again, from Mike Zimmer's defense, because it's kind of weird how we went from, you have Dan Quinn's defense, which is way different than Mike Zimmer's defense, which is way different than Matt Eberflus's defense, right? So it's going to be much more emphasis on a 4-man rush and a lot of zone coverage. Mm-hmm. And now we might, with Micah Parsons, instead of moving around and doing all, everything throughout the defensive formation that he would usually do, is he now just a true edge player? Is he now just a defensive end? Is he going to take that away? Because Eberflus is not known to get real exotic in his fronts and move guys around and have all the same packages that Mike Zimmer would.
Yeah, I think Matt Eberflus is a fun hire for them at defensive coordinator. And I think, like I said, Micah Parsons maybe not be as creative with him, but he's still one of the top edge defenders in the league regardless. So that's going to be really interesting. And you mentioned before they got to pay him. They are 16th in offseason assets right now, 13th in draft capital, and they have negative $4.5 million in effective cap space, so 26th in the NFL in effective cap space. So not a lot of money to play with, but they do have some draft picks to make in the NFL draft to try to build around this team. And I think honestly, Dalton, what they got to do, you mentioned before, add talent at running back, whether that be Ashton Jeanty at number 12 overall if he's there, or in a deep running back class, you could add one on day 2 as well and be a starting running back because of how good this running back class is. Improve one of the worst run Ds in the NFL as well. You mentioned that before as well. And I think a big thing, make sure you're not as top heavy. It felt like so many times last year with Dallas that it was Dak Prescott, it was CeeDee Lamb, it was Micah Parsons, and that was it. Like, they were a very, very top-heavy team in terms of their superstars. And, yes, they do have some superstars. Just get more depth, though, right? Because you need to have more than just 3 players on a 53-man roster. And they have more than that, obviously. But it just seemed like they were relying way too much on their superstars last year and ultimately why they did not make the playoffs.
I think offensively especially, they have to hit better in the draft. I think they've done a good job. Their secondary still has some good players. Obviously, Trayvon Diggs, when he's healthy. Jordan Lewis back there is a really good player.
Deron Bland,
Deron Bland. It's a shame to see what happened with DeMarvion Overshown, and the injury might miss a good chunk of 2025, if not all of it. But I think offensively especially, they really need to hit on some draft picks. I think the Tyler Guyton rookie season really hurt them because we have no answer really on who their left tackle is. Terrence Steele's been struggling at right tackle. That's where I look at is on the offensive line. They need to just get better up front, especially with run blocking. They just didn't have any balance, and with the lack of creativity that they used in their offense this past season, it really made things way too hard for Dak Prescott. And I know there was a regression in his stats, and he wasn't as good as the year before when he was second in MVP voting, but they didn't help him out at all. It's an offense that just did not offer any creativity or any sort of layering to what they wanted to do, and that's in part because they couldn't run the ball. So I do think, again, on both sides of the ball, running and stopping the run, offensive line and defensive line are going to be big focuses for this team.
Yeah, the 7th worst receiving grade in the NFL this past year, the 2nd worst rushing grade in the NFL this past year. They need to improve that. And yes, they have a superstar receiver in CeeDee Lamb, but I think adding another receiver, obviously adding a starting caliber running back, adding more at offensive tackle, and even edge defender, I think, as well. DeMarcus Lawrence, maybe not getting a little long in the tooth, DeMarcus Lawrence is. I think adding another edge defender could be important as well. But they do have a lot to work with, right? You have a borderline top 10 quarterback in Dak Prescott. Don't know, honestly, with any of these other jobs that they even have that. You could say that for. You got CeeDee Lamb. He's one of the best receivers in the NFL. You got Micah Parsons, one of the best defensive players in the NFL. They were the 4th best pass rushing grade in the NFL as a team as well. So a lot to work with in Dallas for Brian Schottenheimer, but also a lot to improve for the Dallas Cowboys right now, and not a lot of money to play with this offseason either. Before we move on to some of the other jobs in the NFL offseason, we got to talk about one of the sponsors of the show. That is Cherry Bundy, the performance drink fueling the Healthlete revolution. It's got natural products and ingredients with no added sugar. Tart cherries are the highest antioxidant fruit or vegetable in the world. It's a natural anti-inflammatory with incredible benefits like reduced soreness, increased recovery, and it contains naturally occurring melatonin to help improve your sleep, and it helps support your immunity. It's used by nearly 500 collegiate and professional sports teams. Every NFL team uses Cherry Bundy as a part of their daily regimen. 10 of the last 11 Super Bowl champions. Every team playing in Europe or Brazil this year had Cherry Bundy with them. All but one Power 4 conference football team. Every NCAA football and basketball national champion since 2007 used Cherry Bundy as well. Their products are available on Amazon, cherrybundy.com, and at retailers nationwide, including Publix and Kroger. And you can get 20% off if you use the code PFF20 at cherrybundy.com. Again, 20% off using code PFF20 at cherrybundy.com. All right, next team we're talking about is a hire that originally looked like it wasn't going to happen, and then they fired their general manager, and then Liam Cohen said, you know what, I will take the job now. So Liam Cohen, the new head coach of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Doug Peterson was fired after 3 years and a 22-29 record with the Jaguars. Liam Cohen was the Buccaneers offensive coordinator for one season, and they were terrific in that 1 year. 5th in EPA per play. Baker Mayfield had the highest graded season of his entire career. Liam Cohen was also very successful at Kentucky and with the Rams as well as the offensive coordinator. So it's going to be really interesting. I think a big reason why Liam Cohen was hired, Dawn, is the Baker Mayfield part of it, where he was so good under Liam Cohen, and now you have a guy in Trevor Lawrence making $55 million a year. You're hoping he could turn into that superstar quarterback that you thought he could be coming out of Clemson. I think this hire was really all about making sure Trevor Lawrence turns into that superstar quarterback you think he can be.
And despite the windy road to get here, that's what it should have been about this entire time. When you look at really the top targets that they had, they wanted Ben Johnson, and he just didn't take the job again because of Trent Baalke's presence. They had thought about a guy like Joe Brady. Now Liam Cohen is actually going to be the head coach. I think that was always the idea. You have to build this team around Trevor Lawrence. I mean, you have to protect him first of all, because now he's dealt with injuries the past 2 seasons because the pass protection's fallen apart. Right? They got Brian Thomas Jr., who was a home run in last year's draft, but they need to add a little more to that. The Gabe Davis signing kind of busted through year one, but I think the thing for Cohen that I like the most, and you mentioned it with Baker Mayfield. Mayfield had a great season. Cohen knew how to make his life easy, right?
Yep.
Talk about all the motions and motioning guys open. The Bucs were 2nd in the league in the regular season in yards after catch. The Jaguars were 23rd. That tells me, on top of all the great throws and all the great things Baker Mayfield did, he knew how to get the ball in his athletes' hands. Because the Bucs have a lot of weapons. He had 2 good backs. He had 3 or 4 good receivers. Cade Otton at tight end. You had a lot of weapons to work with, and when you have that, you can distribute the ball to any of them, knowing what their talents can do with the ball in their hands, and just keep getting first downs, right? This is why we saw the Bucs beat the Detroit Lions earlier in the year, why they beat the Eagles, why they went out to L.A. and beat a really good defense like the Chargers and put up, I think, 40-plus points on them, is because they know how to manufacture first downs when they need to. It's not all just about Baker Mayfield taking shots downfield. And it was the opposite with the Jags this year, where there were too many times where I just felt like their idea was, We have Trevor Lawrence, who's got a cannon. We've got Brian Thomas. We've got Gabe Davis. We're just going to throw a bunch of go balls and deep balls and see where it goes. It's not how the NFL works. You just don't chuck up go balls like you play it like with the Tennessee Volunteers or something like that, and you just run by people. That's not how it works. They need to manufacture first downs in this offense. I thought Cohen did as good a job as anybody with Tampa Bay this year at doing that. And you got to remember, too, it's not just Baker Mayfield. He's done really good work in 2 different stints with the Rams, and he was really the reason that Will Levis was thought of as such a highly regarded prospect back at Kentucky, because when Cohen left the next year, then Levis' performance at Kentucky kind of dropped off. He went high in the draft anyway, first pick of the second round, but it wasn't quite what it was that year that he had Cohen calling plays for him down there. So, look, he knows how to run an offense. He knows how to surround a quarterback with talent, and he knows how to get the ball into the weapons' hands. And I think you're going to see especially a huge year out of Brian Thomas Jr. because you started to see it late this year, the number of different ways they used him. Obviously an incredible rookie year that we're not talking about enough because of some other guys. But they've got Lawrence. They've got a number 1 receiver. They just have to build around that.
Will Levis, in 2 years at Kentucky, one with Liam Cohen, had a 90.6 PFF grade. The next year without Liam Cohen, 68.6 PFF grade. So that is absolutely, does make the quarterback's life a lot easier. And for a guy who's a roller coaster like Will Levis to rein him in and post a 90.6 grade in the SEC, yes, I know it's still college football, but still, it's very impressive for Liam Cohen considering, like I said, how much of a roller coaster Will Levis has been in his entire career, honestly, collegiately and in the NFL. So the Jaguars do have a defensive coordinator in Anthony Campanile, who was the Packers linebackers coach and run game coordinator. Do not have an offensive coordinator right now, but the current heavy favorite to get that job is the Rams passing game specialist, Nate Scheelhaase, right now as well. So we'll talk about Campanile, though, Dalton. What do you think about that for the defensive coordinator job?
I think with this defense, they just need somebody who's going to come in here and run a fundamentally sound operation. Because I think this defense has talent, right? You have Josh Hines-Allen, you have Trayvon Walker on the other edge, you have Devin Lloyd and Foye Oluokun at linebacker, you have Tyson Campbell, you have Andre Sisco back there at safety. There are players to work with. I just think it was a matter of execution, and honestly, this past year, coaching putting them in a bad spot. They ran so much man coverage when they don't have the team that can run that. It's almost like they just kind of at some point in the year kind of just quit on getting creative with the game plan. And I think Campanile can go in there, and we've seen, working under Jeff Hafley this year, the adjustments that were had even with Hafley, where it was like, okay, I can't run this the same way as I did at Boston College, right? So I think especially in the front seven, there's a lot of talent to work with, and I think they have a big advantage with that fifth overall pick in the draft. Because look, we keep drafting them, mock drafting them a defensive player, right? When you talk about a Mason Graham or a Travis Hunter, there is room here. It's not completely bare. Right, you have at least one elite pass rusher. Tyson Campbell, we've seen, I think it was in 2022 or 2023, he was an elite corner that year. They have talent. He just has to go in there and get him to execute. So I'm really kind of curious. It feels like for Campanile, it's a clean slate. It's a really clean slate with a defense that's not completely bare of talent.
Yeah, and you got Eric Armstead as well that can help out.
Yeah, on the inside,
line.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned before, a 5th overall pick. They're 8th in offseason assets this year, according to our rankings, 2nd in draft capital, and they have about $28 million in effective cap space, is 17th in the NFL as well. For me, Dawn, I'm looking at that number 5 overall pick, and if Travis Hunter is there, you take him.
Absolutely.
Right? But after that, I would say number 2 for me, Mason Graham, the D tackle from Michigan, and number 3 is his teammate, Will Johnson, the cornerback from Michigan. Those 3 are at the top of my big board for the Jaguars right now, and one of those 3 should be available with that number 5 overall pick.
Absolutely. When you consider there's going to be 2 quarterbacks taken ahead of them, and we're starting to think that Abdul Carter is going to be taken ahead of them, so they're going to get their pick there. And I think the only other sleeper one that we might think about is an offensive lineman, somebody like Will Campbell, because they do need to rebuild this offensive line. I think if they're able to do that, whether it be through free agency or the draft, you could talk about this team getting back into the playoff picture, because that's really what's fallen apart the last year and a half is their offensive line. They are unable to run the football at all as they're currently constructed. And we've seen, again, Trevor Lawrence getting hurt. And I know this year it was a scramble and a slide, but there's been too often where he's been under pressure and asked to do things under pressure that really no quarterback is capable of. So I think those are going to be big priorities, is the offensive line and I think the secondary. You mentioned Hunter and Will Johnson. If Mason Graham is there, obviously he's a primetime talent. It's hard to pass him up. But to add talent to a secondary, and honestly, they're a defense that I watched a lot last year, And I just went, they just don't execute, and their coaches put them in bad spots. I think they are better than this. So I don't think there's that far to go on this defense. And then you add a premier talent like Hunter or Johnson along with Tyson Campbell at corner, you could really be talking about a good unit.
Correct me if I'm wrong. They just run a ton of man coverage this past year.
Like
right?
A top 3 rate of man coverage when they did not have the personnel for that.
Yeah.
It's honest. It felt like some weeks they went out there and were just like, they're going through the motions, which I didn't understand. I know they got off to a rough start, 0-4, 0-5, but you got to go out there and game plan. So, I mean, it doesn't matter now. They've got a new coaching staff in there, and in theory, that should improve. But that's all I see as a team. If they can get out there and just motivate them to execute defensively, they have enough talent to win games.
Yeah, I think finding an identity on defense is going to be huge for Anthony Campanile in his first year as defensive coordinator. You mentioned fixing the O-line. They were 23rd in offensive line grade this past year. And then, honestly, helping Trevor Lawrence take the next step, that is the reason why Liam Cohen was hired. He was 19th in PFF grade this past year, has yet to finish in the top 10 of PFF grade in his entire career, but they are pot committed to him, right? They're paying him $55 million. And I think you and I would both agree that Trevor Lawrence is still a quarterback that has immense potential and could absolutely still be a consistent top 10 quarterback in the NFL. Just hasn't really had the right supporting environment for him yet. And hopefully with Liam Cohen there now, he might actually have that now.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think you have to remember he's still only been in the league for 4 years.
Yeah.
How many guys have we seen recently who it's been their 7th, 8th, 9th year in the league and finally had the breakout?
He's a victim of the ridiculous hype he had. I remember, Dalton, this might speak to me being a true sicko. I remember reading articles about an 8th grader named Trevor Lawrence and how he was turning heads and being called the next Peyton Manning. He was the number 1 overall recruit the entire time he was in high school. When they first came out with rankings for his class, he was number 1, and when he ended his senior year, he was number 1. He has been the guy, the chosen one, his entire life, goes to Clemson, wins a natty in his first year at Clemson, has a ridiculously good career at Clemson afterwards, is the number 1 overall pick, is talked about like in the likes of John Elway and Andrew Luck as like the best quarterback prospect ever, and he's been like good in his career so far, but he hasn't been like Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen good, or Lamar Jackson good yet. I think that's kind of, he's a victim of his own hype a little, because anyone else, you'd be like, okay, this is still like a pretty good career so far for a young quarterback. For Trevor Lawrence, is the amount of hype he's had since he was like 12 years old. It's just, he hasn't quite lived up to that hype yet, but I still think he's got a lot of potential.
I think there's just too many times in his first 4 years that his development's been stunted, right? His first year, the 1 year under Urban Meyer was pretty much a complete waste because that team had no identity whatsoever. And then, you could see the development happening with Doug Peterson, and then by the time the second year with him ended, the offensive line had fallen apart. And it doesn't matter if you're Trevor Lawrence, if you're Patrick Mahomes, if you're whoever, if your offensive line is as bad as it's been for the last year and a half in Jacksonville, you're not going to succeed. This is the NFL. You can't just dance around it and be the better athlete and all of that. Even obviously never had that issue at Clemson because they were stacked on all those teams. But I think if this team can protect him, and now you've got the best receiver that he's ever played with in Brian Thomas Jr., along with Christian Kirk, along with Evan Ingram, Travis Etienne, all the other guys who can catch the ball, this can still work. They can absolutely still compete with Houston. They just have to, honestly, just certain spots on the team, especially the offensive line, they just have to be functional because he's got all the talent in the world. Yeah,
a lot of talent there and a lot of talent defensively as well. You mentioned before Josh Hines-Allen, Trayvon Walker. So really enticing for the Jacksonville Jaguars right now, and Trent Baalke no longer the general manager as well. So I know a lot of Jaguars fans are probably pretty happy about that. So we'll see what happens with Liam Cohen and Trevor Lawrence next year. Should be a very, very exciting pairing with the two of them, but not the most exciting pairing for a new head coach and a quarterback, Dalton, because that will be the Chicago Bears. Hiring Ben Johnson as their new head coach, the former Lions offensive coordinator. They fired Matt Eberflus after 3 years and a 14-32 record. Talk about hype. Ben Johnson might be the most hyped coordinator, go to head coach I can remember, honestly. He's been the Lions OC for the last 3 years, second in EPA per play during that span, and third in yards per play during that span as well for Ben Johnson. I remember after his first year as the Lions OC, he was getting looks for head coaching jobs. I believe he denied the Panthers job right after his first year, and then he declined the Commanders job last year. He's been biding his time, waiting for the perfect job to open up, and to him, at least, he thinks this Bears job is the one for him.
The perfect job, and even all the way up to examining the front office. I believe he wanted that Jacksonville job, and Trent Baalke's what prevented him from taking that too, so he pivoted to the Bears and liked that situation better. You mentioned it. I mean, just an unstoppable offense the last 3 years. 7th in offensive grading in 2022, second in each of the last 2 years. I mean, we've just watched this Lions team tear everybody apart. And now I think what you get with Ben Johnson, and we'll talk about Dennis Allen in a minute, is a complete transition in what the goals are going to be for an offense, assuming Johnson, keeps the same philosophy he did in Detroit. Heavy running the ball, heavy play action, heavy throwing over the middle. And those are all things the Bears really did not do this past year. We saw Caleb taking way too many dropbacks, obviously falling behind early in games. You have to when you're trying to get back into it, and that's usually when Caleb was his best, playing hero ball. But they have to be able to work in structure in this offense, really create an identity, because, the stretch early in the season when the Bears looked halfway decent, they had a little bit of balance, right? And I think obviously the interior of the offensive line has been a focus. It's going to be this offseason, but you've got a good pair of tackles in Braxton Jones and Darnell Wright. They did a nice job running off tackle, getting in the bootleg game, and then there was just times they just almost willingly got away from it. And then there was Shane Waldron getting fired and Thomas Brown running the team, Eberflus getting fired. It was just a whole... They just never knew. It felt like they came in last year and never knew what they wanted to do in Chicago. And it showed on the field. It showed in the play calling. And I think they just never had a handle on, okay, this is how we're going to make it. Just like I talked about, trying to making Baker Mayfield's life easier, making Trevor Lawrence's life easier. At no point did they make Caleb Williams' life easy. So, there is a part where did he play all that well? Not really. I know the traditional stats would tell you, but I think, what was it, a 65 passing grade, if that's somewhere around there. Early in games, you could tell there was just no plan. They went out there, and there was too many 3-and-outs in the first quarter. They were one of the worst offenses in the league in their first 15 plays in the first quarter, first half, however you want to put it. Now you have Ben Johnson, who always has a plan. He's got a 7-layered plan for everything. He's got trick plays with people pretending to fall over, and everything the Bears have seen the last few years. I just think you have a level of creativity and, in theory, a level of execution that just has not existed with the Bears in a long time. And now it's just about developing Caleb into that and working within that structure.
Absolutely. And don't get me wrong, the Lions were supremely talented offensively during his tenure there. But also, I think a big reason why they were second in EPA per play over the last 3 years, he was maybe the most creative offensive coordinator we had in the NFL as well. So I'm really excited. You have one of the most creative, or maybe the most creative offensive mind that we have in the NFL in Ben Johnson. And you have a quarterback in Caleb Williams, who is hyped up as being one of the most creative quarterback prospects we've had in recent memory as well. I think there is a limitless ceiling with what he could do with Ben Johnson and Caleb Williams together. I'm really excited about that pairing, and that's really why they hired him overall. The offensive coordinator for the Bears now is Declan Doyle. He was the Broncos tight ends coach, a lot like Ben Johnson, who was a former tight ends coach, then turned the Lions OC, trying to do the same thing with Declan Doyle, going from the Broncos tight ends coach to the Bears OC. And then Dennis Allen, the former Saints head coach, is now the defensive coordinator for the Chicago Bears as well.
Yeah, no, I think Dennis Allen is the interesting one there. And you see with all three of these guys, there's kind of a loose Sean Payton connection there, with Doyle, being under Payton last year as his tight ends coach, and he was under Dennis Allen 1 year in New Orleans. He was under Sean Payton since 2018, I believe it was, in New Orleans. So you have, I think, in Doyle, Johnson's going to call the plays. We know this. There's no question about that. He's not giving up play calling. And Doyle's younger than me, in fact, so I don't think he's going to. Wow. Yeah, he's 28, 29 years old, somewhere in there. And what you have, though, is a guy who comes from a similar background under Sean Payton and is going to be able to communicate. And you mentioned that he was a tight ends coach, maybe even work with the offensive line a little bit more now. Everything's about communication throughout your staff. So even if you're an offensive coordinator who's not calling plays, you have a huge part during the week in just getting the game plan across to your players and the foundational concepts across to your players, especially up front. I think that's where it's going to be a big key for him. And likely, obviously, Ben's going to work with Caleb Williams personally, but this is going to be a group effort to get, I think, those two areas of their team improved, the quarterback and the offensive line. Dennis Allen's interesting to me because I do think, let me circle back to the whole thing. I think this is going to take a year of transition. This past year when they got Caleb Williams and Rome Odunze and Keenan Allen, all the weapons they got, you had people calling out Bears for the playoffs, Bears for the NFC title game, 12, 13 wins, all this stuff. I don't think they don't. First of all, they don't need to be doing that because I think the Bears did fall victim to high expectations in that city. it's going to take a transition year because Ben Johnson's offense is very different from what they were running last year, and Dennis Allen's defense is completely different from what they ran with Matt Eberflus the last 3 years. It's a ton of man coverage. He used to be more aggressive. He laid off the blitzing a little bit the last couple years as a head coach in New Orleans, but you're going from as heavy a four-man rush zone coverage team to now Dennis Allen, who runs a boatload of man coverage and is usually more aggressive with the blitzing. I think it is going to take a year of transition for Johnson and Allen both to get the type of players that they want in this defense. You might see some roster turnover over the next calendar year, this offseason and next, just to get the guys that fit in with this offense and with this defense. I'm not expecting the Bears to – some are going to expect it. I'm not expecting the Bears to make the postseason in 2025. I'm not going to pick it. Just the way things have been lately, especially, we need to see a lot of development from some young players. I think it's a transition year to really establish the identities for Ben Johnson and Dennis Allen, and then we'll see where it goes in 26.
Well, listen, they have a lot to work with to get their guys in there. They are third in offseason assets this year. In terms of their draft capital, in terms of restructure potential, and in terms of effective cap space. 10th in draft capital, 7th in effective cap space with about $54.5 million in effective cap space as well. So a lot to work with Chicago, a lot to work with even in the building they have, right? You have an exciting young quarterback in Caleb Williams. You mentioned DJ Moore, Roman Dunze, Darnell Wright, Braxton Jones on that offensive line as well. Some good players in the secondary between Jalen Johnson and Kyler Gordon. They were 11th overall in defensive grade last year, 10th in coverage grade. But in terms of what they need to do, they got to build in the trenches, especially in the interior offensive line. The Lions had the third highest graded offensive line when Ben Johnson was their offensive coordinator. So I think building in the offensive line is critical. I think really you could see that number 10 overall pick probably be an offensive lineman, whether that be a Will Campbell and kick him inside to guard or center, whether that be maybe a Calvin Banks Jr. and do the same thing. I think that's a really, really critical part. And defensive line, they were 24th in defensive line grade this past year as well. So I think building in the two trenches for them is huge. And the other thing, too, just help Caleb Williams along in his development, kind of slow the game down for him a little bit, and also utilize what he does best. I think there's a lot of times you mentioned before how the Bears last year with Shane Waldron calling plays, just use him as a straight drop back passer, roll him out a little bit, man. He's one of the best quarterbacks we've ever seen in college football in terms of when he was rolling out. Let him do that a little bit more. Let him, show off that creativity. I think Ben Johnson, how creative he is, he will put Caleb Williams in positions to succeed. And I think, looking at what he had of Jared Goff is not that, right? He's not a guy that's going to roll out. He's a guy who's going to win from the pocket. So Ben Johnson, as he's a great OC, catered his offense to that. Now with Caleb Williams, there's more of the playbook you could open up with, right? So we might not have even seen the best play calls from Ben Johnson, which is crazy to say. So I am really, really excited to see what a creative offensive mind like Ben Johnson can do with a guy who has limitless physical tools like Caleb Williams.
Absolutely. I mean, you just mentioned it, and Johnson even said in one of his first press conferences, look, Caleb Williams isn't Jared Goff, right? There's certain things that Jared Goff knows as a veteran that Caleb doesn't yet, and Caleb's obviously more mobile, and he's got to tailor the offense to him, but this team is going to improve as they improve in the trenches. It's about offensive line and defensive line. It was my concern going into 2024. It's my concern coming out of 2024. The interior, like you mentioned, especially, you got a good pair of tackles. You got to fix the inside, especially for a guy who holds the ball as long generally as Caleb Williams does. And then I just think, to me, they need more out of their D-line as well. I know you have Montez Sweat, but they need to find somebody else as a pass rusher who's a threat aside from Montez Sweat. Sweat is good. He's not one of the elite pass rushers in the NFL. It would really help them to get one of those guys off the other edge to really beef up that pass rush.
Absolutely. All right, before we go down to the next two teams that hired head coaches and the final two teams that hired head coaches in this cycle, we've got to talk about one of the sponsors of the show. That is DraftKings. Have you played Pick 6 from DraftKings yet? Well, what are you waiting for? You better get on it. The Super Bowl is here, and time is running out. As the official daily fantasy sports partner of the NFL, DraftKings does fantasy sports like nobody else. Play for better payouts on Pick 6. Super easy to get started. Select two or more players. Choose if they'll have more or less of a stat like touchdowns, yardage, sacks, and more. Pick 6 is available in most states, including Missouri, California, Texas, Georgia, and more. And DraftKings is making it even sweeter for first-timers. New Pick 6 customers. Play $5, get $50 in pick six credits. A matchup I like, Travis Kelce here in the Super Bowl. He is the relied on target for Patrick Mahomes in the biggest spots. There's no bigger spot, obviously, than the Super Bowls. I'm taking the over on Travis Kelce's receiving yards right there at 61.5. Win more cash on pick six. Download the DraftKings Pick Six app and use code PFF. That's code PFF for new customers to play $5 and get $50 in pick six credits only on DraftKings Pick Six. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org in Connecticut. Must be 18 plus age and eligibility restrictions vary by jurisdiction. Pick Six is not available everywhere, including New York and Ontario. Void where prohibited. One per new customer. Bonus awarded as non-withdrawable Pick Six credits expire in 30 days. Limited time offer. See terms at picksix.draftkings.com/promos. Next up, Dalton, is your team, the New York Jets, hiring Aaron Glenn as the head coach after firing Robert Saleh after a 4-year and 20-36 record tenure with the Jets. Aaron Glenn was the Lions defensive coordinator for 4 years, 5th in defensive grade, 11th in EPA per play this last year, despite a ton of injuries on that side of the ball, and also played 8 years for the Jets, was a 2-time Pro Bowler, and he's a member of the Jets' all-time 4-decade team. So a lot like Mike Vrabel, he was a pretty damn good player for the franchise he's now coaching as well. What do you think of this hire for the Jets?
I think this came down to, one, familiarity with the organization, right? Obviously as a player, and you mentioned as a scout. And two, the fact that it just seemed Aaron Glenn really wanted this job, right? There were two guys that Glenn wasn't quite as outwardly vocal about it because the Lions were still in the postseason, but it seemed like the two guys that really wanted this Jets job, which I think is more and more rare as the years go on, were Aaron Glenn and Rex Ryan, and they would have been taking the ultimate wild card swing if they would have gone with Rex Ryan. All due respect to what he did with the Jets the first time around, maybe they just needed someone a little more forward-thinking and in the game right now who hasn't been out of it for 10 years. Now, I think that's a big part of it. I think the fact that Glenn wanted this job and wanted to be a leader in this organization, that's really the issue. Look, is coming out of this season and the way everything's gone with Aaron Rodgers, with Robert Saleh, with Nathaniel Hackett, with Joe Douglas, with everything else, nothing on the field matters, right? This is going to sound funny. They need leadership. They need to figure out who the leadership is. It's Aaron Glenn as the head coach, and I think what I like about this early on is he's really established, and I really like that he hired an experienced defensive coordinator like Steve Wilks. He's going to hand Steve Wilks the keys because Steve Wilks deserves the keys to a defense, right? He's been really good for a long time. Aaron Glenn's going to be the leader of this team. He's going to hold people accountable. And look, is there plenty to figure out on the field? Sure, but before that, it's once again about resetting the culture here, because I think we've had too many coaches lately who just have not been able to do that, right? I think Robert Saleh started to get there, but then the quarterback issues and, benching Zach Wilson and Mike White in that year they had in 2022. And then Aaron Rodgers comes in with Nathaniel Hackett, and it feels like Rodgers is running the team, and there just has been a void in leadership for a long time. If Aaron Glenn can bring that, then the rest of the dominoes on the field fall, and we can talk about those. But that's really what they need, is somebody who wanted this job and someone who wanted to take command of this job.
Yeah, I think just establishing a culture in New York is important. And honestly, he's one of the best culture hires that we have. He was a coach that players loved and respected, and fixing the defense is obviously going to be paramount for him as well. They had the 8th lowest graded defense in 2024, despite having superstars on that side of the ball, right? It's almost inexcusable how bad they were defensively last year. I think Aaron Glenn's going to try to fix that immediately when he's there. Alongside Steve Wilks is the new DC for the Jets, mentioned before. And then Tanner Engstrand is the new offensive coordinator. He was the Lions passing game coordinator for recently as well. So exciting coordinator hire, I think, in Tanner Engstrand. I think it's a guy who could be a rising star in this sport.
I think so. I think when you talk about being a tight ends coach first under Dan Campbell, who was pretty much the ultimate tight ends coach, that's a good experience to have. He also worked under Jim Harbaugh way back in his days at the University of San Diego, and he was an analyst 1 year for him at Michigan. I'm curious to see. I think Engstrand's the wild card here. I think we really, obviously, he's never called plays before. My guess would be that he wants to emphasize tight ends and the run game and play action in a similar way as Jim Harbaugh, as Ben Johnson, as anybody else he's worked under, in between. I assume he would want balance and he'd want to build this thing. Look, if you're running this offense, you got to build around Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson. That's just where it's at. Now, the big question is whether Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams are there for one more year, and that adds a wrinkle to it. But even if they're not and they're gone, you have Breece Hall, you have Garrett Wilson. Very quietly, you have a pretty good offensive line, actually. You've got Olu Fashanu, you've got Joe Tippmann, you've got Elijah Vera Tucker. John Simpson was really good. Maybe you have to fill in at right tackle if Morgan Moses leaves, but the one thing that I thought they needed to do last offseason that would put them into the playoff race, that just ended up not because everything else fell apart, was fixing their offensive line. That's the one thing they actually did a pretty good job of this year. So I think they have a foundation up front. They have Breece, they have Garrett. We don't know. I don't think Glenn is opposed to Aaron Rodgers for one more year, but they can't wait much longer for him to make that decision because you have to figure out, let's just say, draft time. We keep talking about, well, who could trade up for a quarterback for a Shedeur Sanders, a Cam Ward, if the Browns maybe are going to trade down. The Jets are going to be maybe the first team on that list, right? If you're talking about, okay, they need a guy for the future. Because otherwise, if Rodgers retires and they don't get that done, you're probably starting Tyrod Taylor this year. And nobody's going to expect you to make the playoffs with Tyrod Taylor as your quarterback. Could he be productive? Sure, but you're threading the needle with how much you need to improve the rest of this team. A defense that went from first in grading in 2023 to 24th this season. So I think that's the first question, obviously, that has to be answered offensively. Is it Aaron Rodgers or is it not? And what are our intentions in the draft?
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of the draft, they are 11th in draft capital, 5th in offseason assets total. They have about $15.3 million in effective cap space as 20th in the NFL. You mentioned before, they have a rebuilt offensive line to work with, a lot of young stars to work with as well, and Breece Hall, Garrett Wilson, Sauce Gardner, and Quinnen Williams. The big thing is just figure out the plan of quarterback. Is it Aaron Rodgers for another year? Do they trade up to get a Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward? Do they wait a year with a stopgap like Tyrod Taylor and then hope to get, say, an Arch Manning or somebody else in the 2026 NFL draft? They've got to just figure out a plan at quarterback right now. I think that is probably priority number one for New York. But Aaron Glenn, the new New York Jets head coach, former Lions defensive coordinator, Lions losing both coordinators now to head coaching jobs. Next one we're talking about is the Las Vegas Raiders, running it with Pete Carroll, now back as an NFL head coach after a year off. He was the Seahawks head coach for 14 years from 2010 to 2023. The Raiders fired Antonio Pierce after 1 year, 1.5 years really, a 9-17 record. Pete Carroll delivered his first Super Bowl to the franchise for the Seattle Seahawks. He's one of 3 coaches ever to win a Super Bowl and a national championship, doing so at USC. Barry Switzer and Jimmy Johnson were the other 2 coaches to accomplish that feat. He has a 137, 89, and 1 record with the Seahawks, 6 division titles in his career as an NFL head coach with the Jets, Patriots, and Seahawks, 12 playoff appearances, and 2 Super Bowl appearances as well. So, by all accounts, a very, very successful coach. Pete Carroll was in college and the NFL, and I think really, Dawn, he built a winning program in Seattle. He reset the culture there in Seattle, reset the culture in Las Vegas as well. The Raiders have had 3 straight losing seasons, and they've missed the playoffs in 7 of the last 8 years. So I think Pete Carroll's a guy who's going to stabilize what is a very kind of dysfunctional franchise a little bit right now.
I think you said it there, and I think something that Mark Davis and Tom Brady specifically wanted, because it sounds like he had a heavy hand in this, is he wanted a proven winner, right? And I think there weren't too many of those out on the market here, maybe a Mike McCarthy, but not at the level of Pete Carroll, right? And Pete Carroll's another one of these hires where you're looking for leadership, right? In a time where the franchise seems a little bit lost, they obviously don't have a quarterback. They just went through a horrible season, only winning 4 games and still only get the number 6 pick in the draft. This is another team we could talk about trading up, but I think they wanted an experienced winner, someone who can go in there and make these guys believe, right? Because they went through it with Josh McDaniels. Now that, they had a stretch in 2023 in the second half where they played better under Antonio Pierce, and now this last year, it all fell apart on them because, honestly, with their quarterback situation and walking into this past season with Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell, what made anybody believe they could win any games with that? I mean, you're just setting yourself back almost intentionally for another year because they didn't find any solution at quarterback. And honestly, how are the players in the locker room supposed to believe in that when they're just not going and getting a quarterback? So I don't know if it'll be a free agent option like Sam Darnold. I don't know if they'll trade up in the draft or figure out a solution there, but they need somebody who can go in there and make them believe they can win. And Pete Carroll's the ultimate optimist, right? As a head coach, it's just That's what he does. Listen, we're going to go out here, we're going to play good football, and we're going to feel good about what we're doing. I think that's an element that they really thought about making this hire.
They may try to trade up for Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders. I think the most likely thing right now is that they sign Russell Wilson. They obviously work together a lot in Seattle. I think Russell Wilson's currently a free agent as well. Russell Wilson to Las Vegas as kind of a bridge quarterback for whoever they decide is the quarterback of the future. I think that could be ultimately the move. They go. I think they also need to fill some, the skill position talent a lot as well. They need to help at receiver and running back. And they had the worst coverage grade in the NFL, not only this year, but over the last 4 years as well. So they got to fix that too. But he's got a lot to work with, right? Yes, the Raiders are second in offseason assets. They are third in draft capital. They have about $86 million in effective cap space. That's second in the NFL to only the New England Patriots, talking about before them as well. Have a new offensive coordinator. Chip Kelly is now the new OC in Las Vegas. He was the Ohio State offensive coordinator this past year, and Ohio State won the national title this past season. And Patrick Graham is remaining as the Raiders defensive coordinator as well. What do you think about those two coordinator, or one of the coordinator hires?
Boy, Chip Kelly, that's pretty fun considering we just saw his last game at Ohio State down there at Atlanta, and what a job he did. It makes you wonder a little bit. You mentioned the quarterback situation. You signed Russ as a bridge. It's certainly not in the first round, but was Will Howard going there with him? Do we have to start speculating about that? But no, Kelly did a fantastic job. Look, did a really good job at UCLA in his 6 years as a head coach there. He's been relatively successful everywhere he's been, except for that 1 year with the 49ers when they really didn't give him a shot. And then this year as the OC in Ohio State, just a spectacular job on the way to a national championship. And, man, they're paying him, I believe I heard the rumor, they're paying him over $6 million a year to do this. So, I mean, Pete Carroll, look, he knows Chip Kelly well. He used to have to coach against him back in the day. I think he knows he wants to hand Chip the keys, and as such a veteran at both the NFL and college level, it's hard to think he won't put something productive together. And look, got a pretty good offensive line. You've got Brock Bowers. You got Jacoby Myers. I think you have a situation here where you do have to get, I think, a running back is going to be in play there at 6, and you know which one that is from Boise State, Ashton Jeanty. But got to figure out the quarterback, got to figure out how to run the ball better, and they can have a productive offense. And any offense that Chip Kelly's run, they've been able to run the football. That's just what it comes down to first and foremost with him. So I think that's going to be a big priority. But, yeah, just to be able – again, I think Chip Kelly, a proven leader, a proven winner, and a guy who's proven himself productive for years and years hauling offensive plays – I think it speaks to the stability that the Raiders are trying to build. It's an expensive hire, but it's a stable one that most likely is going to work because of Chip Kelly's track record.
And they got to figure out quarterback and running back and add talent at receiver alongside Jacoby Myers. But they have a superstar tight end in Brock Bowers. They have some nice pieces on the offensive line as well between Colton Miller, Jackson Powers-Johnson, Delmar Glaze as well. Obviously, defensively, they still have Max Crosby and Christian Wilkins on the defensive line, so they're really good players as well. So a lot to figure out for Las Vegas, but they have a lot to work with this offseason in terms of draft capital and in terms of cap space. So I'm not going to say it's going to be an overnight turnaround, but like I said, Pete Carroll has won everywhere he's went, and I think he should at least stabilize the Las Vegas Raiders franchise. Last week I talked about Dalton. Haven't hired a head coach yet. The New Orleans Saints have not hired anyone yet. They fired Dennis Allen after 3 years and an 18-25 record. Now the heavy favorite is Kellen Moore, the Eagles offensive coordinator. He won't accept the job until obviously after the Super Bowl this upcoming Sunday. So maybe on Monday we'll hear that Kellen Moore is the new Saints head coach. If it is Kellen Moore, the Eagles this past year were 6th in EPA per play. He was the offensive coordinator for the Cowboys and Chargers before becoming the Eagles offensive coordinator. With the Cowboys, they were 5th in EPA per play, and with the Chargers, they were 22nd in EPA per play. So, one, what do you think about Kellen Moore if he does get the job with the New Orleans Saints? And then two, what do you think about this job overall and what he's got to do there?
I think it's a tough job, and I think we've seen so many guys turn it down or pull out of consideration just because of how tough a job it's going to be. They have the worst salary cap situation in the NFL. They have an aging roster that just won, only 5 games this season. You don't have a long-term quarterback. I would bet Derek Carr is their quarterback in 2025, but I don't think he'll be their quarterback beyond that, right? And you're talking about trying to reset the cap. It's going to start with cutting Derek Carr probably after next year. It's hard for any candidate right now, and Kellen Moore, I think there's been talk that he wanted some assurances that he's going to be given a fair shot beyond the first 2 years, because I don't believe the Saints are going to win very much, at least the next 2 years.
And they shouldn't want to either.
Probably not. They need a top-line quarterback. They need to what they have refused to do since Sean Payton left is tank it out and start over. They kept Dennis Allen, who was already the defensive coordinator there. He was essentially the head coach in waiting. They played average football for a couple of years, under him, and then this year it caved in on him. They haven't drafted well recently. They have kind of been reluctant to lose, right? I know it sounds funny, but being in that middle of the pack, winning 7 or 8 games a year is actually one of the worst places you can be in, because you're not drafting high and you're not making the playoffs, so you're in that in-between zone, and they've just refused to be less than average. And the problem is when you do that, this is where you get stuck. You get stuck in purgatory. So, and especially with the way they've been restructuring contracts, I think they're, $50 million in the hole right now with the cap space?
They are about $58 million. That is the worst in the NFL by $19 million.
I mean, you just year to year, they're playing this game, and they keep extending and like they just extended Alvin Kamara when it's probably not a very sound football move, because they're just trying to save a few bucks under the cap. So it's really the way that they're running their entire construction of their roster. It's just not conducive to winning, right? So it's a team that needs a hard reset, that's refused to take one for 5 years since Peyton and Breeze left. And now this is where they're at, where we're feeling like, okay, there's going to be 2, if not 3 years here where we know they're not going to win. And any head coach coming into this job, because you don't get many second chances, especially when you're a first-time coach and you lose early in your career, you don't get a whole lot of second chances. And if this is a team that you're going to take this job, you have to understand, kind of like Dan Campbell did with the Lions, right, early, where it was like, hey, I know we're not going to win a whole lot of games early. I need to establish our identity. Kellen Moore wants to do that. I think that was part of the negotiations is, look, if you're going to give me a 5-year deal, let me ride it out and assess the entire job that I did, because I can promise you there is not going to be instant gratification here. We are not going to be good in the first 2 years of this. And you can just look at the way their team is. It's an older roster that hasn't drafted well, that has a terrible cap situation. It's not like they're not going to improve much at all, even if they're healthy and Derek Carr is healthy. Maybe they go from 5 wins this year to 6 or 7. What does that do, right? They need a full tilt tear down, and maybe one big enough that they could find themselves another Manning in New Orleans, but they need a reset. And at some point, now what they've done with the way they've done it with their salary cap is some teams can hard reset in 1 year and go, okay, start over. We're bad. We got a top 3 pick this year. We can get that done. This is going to be a multi-year process. And any new head coaching candidate, if it is Kellen Moore, they're going to go, okay, I need time, because this is a train wreck. There's a reason this job, they may not hire a coach until 2 weeks before the combine.
Yeah.
Think about that. When all these other teams were making hires in late December and January, or well, I guess I'm speeding that up a little bit with how long the season is, but even right after the season's over, and they're 2 weeks from the combine and they don't have a head coach. They have no idea what they want to do in this year's draft. So I think it's a tough situation for any of them to walk into, and more power to Kellen Moore for trying it out.
Yeah, if you just take the job, obviously. Yeah, so it's going to be it's fascinating, and I think you're right. The Saints have screwed themselves by just kicking the can down the road for far too long. Honestly, you need to just take a hard reset. They've just been settling for being mediocre for the last few years, and now they're screwed in terms of cap space right now. I mean, they're negative $58 million. Of course, they've always played around with the cap for a few years now, but that's what screwed them over now.
This is a process that's honestly like 4 years overdue.
Yeah.
It made sense to kick the can back when you were still competing for Super Bowls late in Drew Brees' career, and you had that 2017 draft class. I mean, this is what we're talking about with the Saints, is they're still riding guys from the 2017 draft class, which was an all-timer for sure, and still trying to win games in 2024. And they just traded Marshawn Lattimore. I mean, they just extended Alvin Kamara again, drafted that same year. It's just, this is where they're just stuck in that era of we still think we can do it. And you don't have Sean Payton and Drew Brees. You have to start this thing over.
No, you got it. They're 30th in offseason assets. Obviously, a big reason for that is because of the cap space. They're 7th in draft capital. What they do have, I guess, an okay starting quarterback in Derek Carr, a really good number 1 receiver in Chris Olave. Alvin Kamara continues to produce. And then some nice young pieces on defense like Kool-Aid McKinstry, Pete Werner, and Carl Granderson. But in terms of what they got to do, tear it down to the studs, man. I mean, get cap compliant. Don't worry about being competitive. Tank, maybe get Arch Manning next year, right? Get another Manning down there in New Orleans after his grandpa, Archie Manning, played there for a while. And then on the field, improving in the trenches on offensive line and defensive line is a necessity. Finding a future plan at quarterback is key, but I think that's a conversation for next year. I don't think it's a conversation for this year. I don't think they're going to be going hard to get a Cam Worshard or Sanders. I think they're very well, they should be at least aware of, hey, we need to be terrible this upcoming year, get cap compliant, just restart, and then we can worry about getting our quarterback in the future and what it should be a better quarterback class next year. So, yes, finding a future planet quarterback is paramount for any team that doesn't have a franchise quarterback. But for the Saints, this might be a conversation for next year rather than this year.
Just take, with this 9th pick, and I don't even hate the idea of trading down, just take the best player available. You mentioned, I think if it's a pass rusher, so be it. If it's another offensive lineman and you got to shuffle things around, so be it. I mean, they just need talent. I mean, that's just where we're at, especially in the trenches. They just need to add talent to this team because a lot of their more talented players and more productive players are still some of the older guys. I think about a Demario Davis. I think about Cam Jordan still being out there, right? It's just it's a previous era of players that they still are relying on to win games in 2024 and 2025, and it's just not going to work like that. You have to consistently find young talent.
Out of all these jobs, Dalton, before we wrap up, out of all of the ones that just hired a new head coach, which one are you most excited about? Which one do you think could be the biggest success?
I know the way it went down was weird, and there was all the controversy, and now there's some sort of rivalry between Jacksonville and Tampa. I really do like the Liam Cohen hire and the fit that is with Trevor Lawrence, and I think Cohen's track record of working with quarterbacks and having productive offenses, and then the ability of his offense to make Trevor Lawrence's life easier. Now, there's going to be questions on defense, and obviously he's a first-time head coach, as a lot of these guys are, and there's going to be questions about, whether he can lead this team, and especially in a place with Jacksonville where there's been some chaos lately. But curious to see who their GM is going to be because they still don't have that settled. Their offensive coordinator spot. Yeah, they have to find one, but Cohen's going to call the plays. I really like the pairing of Liam Cohen and Trevor Lawrence, and now they just have to get better in the trenches, better in the secondary, and I think you could see them turn that thing around a lot quicker than people think.
Even after the awkward press conference, you still like that hire.
Yeah, I mean, it's a Jacksonville. Jacksonville's a place you have to get used to for sure. I've only been there once. It's a place you certainly have to figure out the environment down there. But no, I think at least from an X's and O's standpoint, I think Cohen and Lawrence is a great fit.
That's what I was going to go with as well. But I think Ben Johnson in Chicago. I mean, it's the most hyped one, and then he and Caleb Williams together. Like I said, that just could be an incredible marriage of.
If that doesn't work, that's an element of like, if that doesn't work, I don't know what will.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just like I don't know what's going to happen then if that doesn't work at all.
The Bears, they may just have to build. If this doesn't work, they'll just have to build the 85 Bears again.
Exactly.
And do it that way.
Yeah, and they got talent offensively as well. It's not like it's just Caleb Williams back there, right? They have some really nice offensive pieces. But that's our full breakdown of every head coaching hire. Obviously, when the Saints hire their next head coach, we'll break that down as well. But let us know in the comments below what you thought, what you think is the best hire, what you think is the worst hire of the cycle as well. We'll be back live tomorrow at 10 a.m. with our full preview of Super Bowl 59 between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Philadelphia Eagles. For producers back there, for Dalton Wasserman, I'm Max Chadwick, and we'll see you guys tomorrow live at 10 a.m. with our full Super Bowl preview.